right, good morning, AP Park High School students, right? We're back with our Chapter 7, right? Notes, this is going to be Chapter 7, Sections 1 and 2. We're going to look at where our ethnicity is distributed, mostly focusing on American ethnicity, right? And then we'll look into how, the difference between an ethnicity and a nation, right? We'll talk a little race as well. All right, so here we go. So ethnicity, right, is identified as, here's your definition. These get a little tricky, right? Identify with a group who share the cultural traditions of a specific homeland, right? So there's that, right? Whereas race has a identity with a group of people who share a biological link, right? It's important to note that in terms of like pure blood, the idea of race is a social construction at this point. It is not necessarily one that is you can identify genetically, that you're 100% this blood or that blood, right? And I know we have genetic heritage and 23andMe and all of that stuff, but right, you do have to. It's associated. People have to perceive you, right, and you have to perceive yourself as a race, right? So it's an identity as it is more or less a scientific piece. All right, so in the United States, we have distribution. Right, if you look at this, again, we got about 2/3 Caucasian or white. We look at about 15% Latino. We see clustering in the Southwest. This makes sense. This is a product of proximity to Latin America, right? African American, we see 13%, right? And so this is and we see this clustered in the Southeast, which were the slave states, right? So we have forced migration causes here, right? Asian American, we're going to see proximity come back again, only about 4%, right? You're going to see cluster in the West. On diversity maps, you don't see a lot of American Indian or indigenous people, or you see a lot of Asian American because the numbers are going to be relatively low, right? Again, we see cluster in the West due to proximity, right? And then we go back to forced migration when we talk about the settlement of, or the resettlement, if you will, of indigenous people in the United States by the government, right? So we see reservations come into play. So Oklahoma plays in there, right? And we also see the Inuit in Alaska.
Think back to the migration unit, guys. We're talking about the exact same maps again. We talked about where people migrated to and from, and then, so it's all coming back together again.
Good. Right, so again, we look at how this is changing, right? The browning of America, if you will, right? So in 2010, we look at about 2/3. This was the stats that you just saw, right? But that's going to shift. We're going to see an increase in Hispanic Latino people, or Latinx, I think is the term we're using these days. You see an increase in Asian, and you see proportionally a drop in white people. Right? Now, again, we're still looking at, does that mean that white people are going away? No, right? Because we're looking at an estimated 439 million. It's just that you're going to see more diversity in the United States, right, as we move along. All right, there's a Latino distribution. Again, you got your Southwest, right? And we see Florida as well. All right, and if breaking that down, we see about 2/3, right, 60%, 63%. Coming from Mexico, we see Puerto Rican, right, clocking in at about 9%. Now, keep in mind, these are naturalized citizens, right, already, as you go. And then we see South America, Central America, right, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, right, and the Caribbean as well. Right, African American descent, again, you see right in here, right in the southeast part of United States, right? Tie that back to, you just learned religion. You got a religion map. Tie that back to the Baptist Church, right, in there as well. All right, Asian American distribution, you're going to see California, right? You're going to see parts of Alaska and Hawaii. Yeah, of course, that would make sense due to proximity as well, all right? And we look at Chinese, Filipino, Indian, Vietnamese, Korean, Japan, right? And again, we use the term Asian, right? It's a broad term, isn't it, right? Asia is huge. So you got Southeast Asian, you have South Asian, you have East Asian countries being represented, right? As well as the other.
Again, going back to Unit 2, migration again. We talked about all this stuff already for sure.
right? American Indian movement, again, you can see movement, the forced migration, the Trail of Tears, right here, right, to Oklahoma, where they moved the Indians, or the indigenous people from there, right? You see here, right? You see here, right, including, Red Lake up in there, right? And then you see, again, Alaska being pretty big.
Just looking at diversity
Yeah.
here overall, so you can see kind of the areas that are more diverse versus less diverse.
Yep. And we're not very diverse.
We are not here in Minnesota.
No, we aren't. Oh, there you go. Get back into the screen. All right. So again, we look at clustering distribution, right? Within cities, we see definitely a correlation between urbanization, right, and diversity, right? 90% of African Americans and Latinx live in urban areas. Why? Why do people move? Jobs, jobs, and jobs, right? And where you're going to move to an urban area. So you see that. Go through some numbers there, right? You can see, this is all in your book, right? And then we also keep in mind that, yes, there's a cause of urban area, but we also see clustering, right? So go back again to your migration patterns, your ethnic neighborhoods, right? You can see that in the Twin Cities as well. All right. Again, we look at urbanization within the African American population. All right. And we look at, here's a map that covers ethnicity within Minneapolis, right? And we see least diverse to most diverse in terms, so we see the cluster within the city.
And going back to urban, we talked about that with urban as well.
Right.
And there's St. Paul.
St. Paul, again, you see Frogtown, right? You see the west side as well, right? You can see some clustering there. All right, again, see this, right, amongst our Hmong population in the Twin Cities. So we got migration happening, coming back at you again, right there, right, at the clustering, right, Frogtown and the east side, right. You see that as well in the Latinx population as well, right. And here you can see huge clustering in Richfield. You can see the Cedar and Lake area of Minneapolis is quite diverse, and then also the west side, right, of St. Paul. All right, again, you see more of that. All right, you see clustering of the indigenous people. Right, so keep in mind that more than half of indigenous people live in urban areas. They're not necessarily it's not every single indigenous person is on a reservation, right? That they are, that there is a connection to American Indians as well. So you see that Little Earth neighborhood in, also off Cedar Avenue, Cedar and Franklin in Minneapolis. All right, and again we see a clustering of Asian populations. Go back to the Hmong, right, map, kind of works the same way there. All right, and African American population, you see clustering in South Minneapolis and North Minneapolis, the Phillips neighborhood here, and then North Minneapolis, right? You see it also in the Midway section of St. Paul. Right,
there's our non-diversity right there.
Right. There's right. So our diversity is right here, right? And keep in mind that the Twin Cities is about at this point, Minneapolis, St. Paul is about 50% white and then 50% other. But that's only in Minneapolis and St. Paul. The rest of the metro area, right, is heavily Caucasian. All right.
So coming back to those, looking at kind of migration flows and things, that was something that we struggled a little bit way back in Unit 2, but you need to know a little bit more about the migration flows again. We're coming back to it. So we talked already today about forced migration with slavery, and then obviously the indigenous people, the natives being forced off their lands as well. And so we look at the 1600s, the 1800s with forced migration in the United States. We get to migrations in northern cities. So people who are leaving the South and moving into the more industrialized North, we see more jobs available. So people are leaving, failure of sharecropping.
This is known as the Great Migration.
Yes. And so we'll look at that. And then finally we get to this idea we also talked about in urban geography as well, of the idea of white flight and block busting, where we're starting to see people leaving the inner city, going for the suburbs and moving to places that they might be more affluent and have better schools, better homes, and things like that. Here's our first one. They're looking at forced migration, obviously slavery and the triangular trade coming from Africa here, going between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. There's another example of it right here with your triangular trade. Then we get into what Mr. Sharon just talking about, the Great Migration here, where people start leaving the South and moving into the cities, all right? And we see them going to places that have some kind of industrial jobs that were opening up at this time for them. All right, we also talked about that when we talked about St. Louis and the creation of Pruitt-Igoe, right? That was part of why they were creating it, is because people were leaving the South and moving into the cities. They thought St. Louis was going to continue to boom.
So we can tie this in history to the Harlem Renaissance. We can tie it to the automobile craze, right? Detroit, we see jobs available, in the automobile trade. We see the stockyards, St. Louis. We see ties to jazz.
For sure.
We see ties to barbecue. Like, there's tons of cultural things that are attached to this as well.
And look at that Rust Belt. Look at how many jobs were opening up in those Rust Belts, all those cities there.
And this one's fairly slept on, but you see a lot of, San Francisco, Oakland area, and LA, right? Which also have that pattern, but you don't hear a lot of that in our history classes.
Looking at race and how it's been used historically to separate people, we already know about slavery in the United States. We've talked about that, but then we get into some of the different Supreme Court cases. We had Plessy versus Ferguson, which talked about making sure that the races could be separated, but they had to have equal facilities. Obviously, separating people and making sure things are equal is not making things equal, right, if they're separated. Eventually, we also can talk about the Jim Crow laws here, too, which was essentially legalized segregation in the United States. And so those are things that if we talk about the civil rights movement and all the things that happened in the South, that is a way that government and laws were used to separate people, to get into this idea of separating the races. South Africa is another really good case study with this when we look at the apartheid that was there. Again, this is physical separation of races, but it wasn't white and black. It was multiple racial groups that were segregated from each other at this point. They could not have the same living areas or homes or neighborhoods. They could not go to the same schools. They had different jobs, and they had different rights. And eventually, this created a very tense area in South Africa. And eventually, we see in the 1990s it's repealed, but some of the effects are still there. They've been continuing to get better and better since that happened, since the repeal of that.
Keep in mind that the Brown versus Board of Education, right, is what repeals the legal segregation, right? Does that mean that segregation doesn't exist in the United States? A little bit like, apartheid. The effects of apartheid are still there, right? The effects of Jim Crow and slavery are still there when it comes to our space, where we live, right, and who we live next to.
So looking at ethnicity, how is ethnicity, everything we've been talking about so far, how is that related to our nationality? When we look at nationality, it is an identity, again, with a group who share legal attachment and allegiance to a specific country. And so we're starting to get into both ethnicity and nationality being defined by what our cultural values are. And there is a distinction, though, between what we call nationality and what we call ethnicity. And sometimes that gets blurred a little bit with what we think about. It's difficult. And so when we start looking at nations and nationality, two nations can actually exist in the same country. We've already talked a little bit about that with language and other aspects here that we've talked about. So when we look at the Quebecois, thank you, in Canada.
That's a great word, isn't it?
It is a great word. The Quebecois in Canada, obviously we know that Quebec has had some feelings of separation and separatism, that they have not wanted to be a part of the other parts of Canada. And so we've talked about that. We talked about Belgium a little bit with Flanders and Wallonia, same kind of idea here. All right, and so it does create conflict when we look at multiple nationalities in the same spot.
Again, tie that back to your culture, tie that back to the language, the French, right? Tie that back to religion. The Catholic majority of Quebecois are Catholic, where the majority of Greater Canada are going to be Protestant and English-speaking. So you can kind of see those big cultural pieces, right, tied to nationality.
So we look at the nation states here. What is a nation state? A nation state, when we talk about it, is an ethnic group that's seeking self-rule and governance over themselves, their nation. And so when they get to this idea, we have self-determination. What does that mean? We're talking about ethnic groups that are seeking to have their own country, their own laws, their own governance, and control themselves. And so a nation-state is a country whose territory is dominated by one specific ethnic group or cultural group. So some of our really good examples have been in Europe, but that's starting to change. Places like Denmark have been a very predominantly controlled by one group,
Most
one
of the
ethnic
Danes
group.
in the world live in Denmark, right?
Right.
Most of the people who live in Denmark are Danes, right? Same with the Germans, same with the French. Japanese are a great example.
Japan's even better, I would say, than these two at this point, because Germany and France, we're seeing major changes because of migration, and we talked about that way back in Unit 2 again. And so a big question down here for you is, can a nation exist without a country? Can they exist without a state? And when we look at it, this is our best example of a nation existing but not having a state, not having political borders. And this is the Kurds. When they drew up the borders in the Middle East, and that was the European powers came in and drew up borders randomly, they left the Kurds out. The Kurds never got their own country.
After World War I, just for historical context here, right? So the Kurds got slighted, right? So look where they are, right? They are the majority in parts, only parts of 1, 2, 3, 4 countries, right? So are they ever going to get their own country? Probably not, right? Because they've been split that way.
And they are major minorities in each of those countries.
So the word here is stateless nation, right? That's a word that you got to know. And if there's one place that this is your best example, right, of a stateless nation. Okay? It's the biggest and the best example.
When we start to get into nation states and how they bring people together, how they build unity, we talk about the idea of nationalism. And so when we start looking at nationalism, it is the pride and the loyalty in your state. And so it can be fostered by things like symbols, like what we have here. It can be fostered by festivals, obviously the flag, our national anthem, and some of the songs. And we've got a flag right here. There you go. Perfect. And so those things build a sense of pride and unity amongst people in a nation. We call those centripetal forces. It's forces that bring people together. We also have those centrifugal forces, which you read about in your book as well. Those are things that divide people. We've already talked about one of them. Multiple languages in a country can divide people. All right. We look at some of the other examples.
They can bring people together too.
It could. Right? It could. We look at some of the other examples. Government can divide people. What are some other examples, Mr. Sheridan?
Economics is going to be huge. Regionalism is going to be huge, right? If you have like a north versus south, if you have different, if you have rich parts, if you have pockets of development, if you have economic backwaters, these are going to divide people, right? Your language, you got religion, could also throw in there. You got city, right? And all of this leads to very depressing time in human geography. This isn't the rainbows and unicorns and confetti cannons unit that we're looking at here, right? Because in America, we think of, can't we all just get along, right? And throughout chapter 7 and 8, the answer is largely going to be no, right? And that's depressing.
Now keep in mind, a lot of those forces we just talked about that were centrifugal, that push people apart, they also can pull people together.
Right.
All right, just how they're being used and how they're being adapted.
If you have a common language, that brings people together. If you have multiple languages, that's going to bring people apart, right? So remember that the word there is centrifuge, right? It comes from the word centrifuge, which is that science instrument that takes a compound and spins it, right? And then separates the compound. So it's a separation thing, right? Whereas centripetal force, centripetal gravity pushes you into a middle, right? It brings people together.
Little science for you today, too.
There you go. That's what we're all about.
When we talk about multinational states, this is a state that has multiple ethnicities living, or multiple nations possibly even living in one multinational state that they've come together with. So when we look at, there's two groups that have feelings of self-determination, but they coexist together peacefully. Our best example is this. The United Kingdom, as we call it, is England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. All right, and so those four nations have come together to live together as a multinational state. All right, they've come together for beneficial, it could be economic, it could be government, whatever it may be. They've come together because they believe that they're stronger as a unit together. All We look at that relationship can change over time. In fact, it has. Ireland used to be part of the United Kingdom as well. They gained independence. We may see changes in the near future because of Brexit, the idea of United Kingdom leaving the European Union.
Leaving
Scotland,
the UK.
Yeah, Scotland might be gone in the near future. So we'll see what will happen.
Their own separate country, right? If you get nothing else from this, at least you can figure out, right, that the UK flag, right, is a combination of those three nationalities, right? And the poor Welsh with their dragon just don't get part
It'd be a
of
nice addition right there in the middle of the Union Jack. Put the dragon
right in there. That'd be awesome.
We look at some of the other newest nation states. The Soviet Union was one. It was between 1924 and 1991. It broke up at that point, but there was hundreds of different ethnicities joined together. 15 national republics joined together, and eventually it was broken up. It could not maintain itself, but that was the largest multinational state at the time anyway. We look at some other new nation states, the Baltics, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, all created here. We look at the European areas. We look at Belarus, Moldova, and Ukraine. And then we've got the stands in Central Asia here. These were all part of the Soviet Union at one point. And so they were created after 1991, a lot of these. Recreated, we should say. They had existed. Some of them, they had come back, and vice versa. There you go. And there they are. Okay, so there's Russia, and then you've got your stands. You've got some of your Caucasus region here. And then you've got your Eastern European areas as well. Obviously, lots of challenges come with multinational states. And Russia, again, they are still the world's largest multinational state at this point today. Not the Soviet Union, but Russia today is. There are 39 different nationalities of people living in Russia. And a lot of them are vying for independence. They don't want to be part of Russia. They are not the same culture, not the same ethnicity. They do not want to be connected to them, but they are. And the best example of this is Chechnya. They are a small Muslim region in the Caucasus region of Asia here, and they have major distinct differences from the rest of Russia. Number one, they're Muslim, right? Most of Russia is not. We look at that. Russia refused to allow them to break apart when the Soviet Union broke apart. And the Russian army has actually been fighting Chechen rebels for over 10 years. It's probably closer to 15 years at this point.
Easily,
Yeah.
right?
So,
it's simmered down a little bit, but it used to be pretty hot and heavy.
But when we look at, they're hesitant to let Chechnya just break away, largely because of this right here. All of these colored regions here that are colored orange or reddish, those are all regions that want to break away from from Russia. And we can see Chechnya is down here, way down in the corner down there in the Caucasus region. And so there's all kinds of other areas that would like to break away. And if the Russians let Chechnya go, all these others are probably going to want to follow suit.
My guess is that there are ethnicities you've never heard of, right, on this map,
for sure.
right?
For sure. There's going back to the Caucasus region because we just talking about Chechnya here with it. The Caucasus region, there are over 12 ethnicities living in this small territory right here between the Caspian and Black Seas. The major countries there, we have Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. And there's all kinds of boundary disputes with the different cultures that are there and all kinds of major problems that we see. And there's our culture. All right, when we look at all the different ethnicities and cultures living, this is the Caspian Sea, here's the Black Sea. We have Georgia, and we have Turkey, and Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and Iran here, and Russia. Everything in here. All of these different ethnicities and cultures are in those 4 or 5 countries.
And you will notice how the borders don't match the ethnicity, right? Like you got, so what do you think Armenia is going to say to Azerbaijan when these borders are put in place? They're going to say, hey, we want to move this over, right? We want to, that there's this enclave of Armenians. The border should be moved to fit our needs, right? Azerbaijan's going to say the same thing about this area right in here, right? The Georgians, right, are going to so right away when these borders are put in place, these borders are highly disputed, right? This area kind of blows up, right? And that's to say nothing of all the other ones who are Azerbaijani or Armenian or Georgian, right? So right now we have Ossetia, right, in here, right, and this is largely going to be an independent. This one might be our newest country at some point, right? It's possible.
And that's it, ladies and gentlemen. So we wrap on chapter 7. Are we at chapter 7? Chapter 8, isn't it?
This is 7.1, 7.2. We still, we still got to talk about ethnic conflict.
We will get back.
Political geography as we go. So hits just keep coming, right? You guys got to keep up. We hope that you are. And we miss you, just so you know. All right? Stay good.